Accordingly. Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, May 22nd. We are continuing our Omer study, which we do each spring, learning Gemara between Pesach and Shavuot. We're actually going to extend one session beyond Shavuot by way of a little housekeeping announcement. Um, we have a session today. We'll have one next Thursday, which is May 29th, and we'll have our last class of the semester on June 5th. Then I'll spend part of the summer recuperating and preparing for our course of study in the fall. We're still working on topics, but I have an idea about studying texts to make sense of senseless times. That's a working title. Much to come. But in the meantime, our unit on marriage and divorce continues. So what I would like to do is invite us to bless together, and then we'll go into our study. We'll pick right up where we left off last week, which was on just introducing the subject of divorce. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And here we go. So just to jog memories, or if you were not able to participate last week and haven't yet caught up with the YouTube recording of our session, the subject on divorce in the Tanakh itself is limited to just a scant number of verses from the 24th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. This is really the only place that talks about divorce in the Hebrew Bible. So, ki yikach ish isha uve'ala, when a man takes a woman and becomes her master. Here they use the word husband, but I want to convey the force of the word Baal, ve'alach, here used as a verb, meaning to husband her, but it is the same root that means to own. It implies, it connotes ownership strongly. Ve'haya'im lo timsachen be'enav, if it so happens that she does not find favor in his sight, ki matzava ervat davar, he finds something displeasing about her. V'chatav lah sefer kritut, he shall write her a scroll of expulsion. Kritut, literally meaning the word is cut. Karet or karat is the Hebrew root for the word to cut. So he shall write her a scroll of being cut off, the natan biyadah, place it in her hand, v'shilchach mi beto, and then send her forth from his household. Um, so that's the beginning of this passage, and then it goes into, well, what happens if history repeats itself and she leaves the house, becomes another man's wife who also rejects her, also writes her what they will translate as a bill of divorcement. But again, when I said a writ of cutting off, I was trying to give the literal force of the words. Hands it to her, sends away from his household, or the man dies who had last taken her as his wife. The law here restricts the first husband from taking her back as a wife again. In biblical terminology, she has been defiled. Ki to'evahi. She is literally abominable. Lifnei Adonai, not to the man so much, but in the presence or in the sight of God. Velo takti et haaretz, and you must not uh, bring guilt or sin upon the earth, Asher Adonai noten lecha nachala, which God has given you as an inheritance. Um, so, and then it goes on to other rules and restrictions pertaining to marriage. And as you can see, as is the way of many of the legally informed passages of the Torah, it seems like without any notice, as Monty Python would say, and now for something completely different. Because just after 5 verses of marriage and divorce stuff, we are talking about pawning hand mills and millstones. You may think that has nothing to do with marriage and divorce, and I guess in one sense you're right, but the Torah tends not to categorize its laws according to what we would assume as, correct categorizations, topics, genres, what have you. So that's where the conversation about divorce in the Hebrew Bible begins and ends. And, if it raises within you some discomfort because of how out of step with modern marriage and divorce practice, including even Orthodox marriage and divorce practice in Judaism, is, then you're not alone. And I guess whenever we encounter a passage that prompts in the modern reader some considerable discomfort, I usually advise that we should sit with that discomfort, acknowledge where it's coming from. For me, I think it's helpful for us to acknowledge that discomfort may be the natural byproduct of looking at these texts from a 21st century American Jewish perspective, when in fact these texts are 2,000, 2,500, 3,000-year old ancient Near Eastern texts conveying all the norms and mores of that society, first and foremost. So, be sure to acknowledge that we're not living in that time or place or in that configuration of Jewish civilization. And then, just as much, maybe take heart and take comfort that if you study the rabbinic tradition, you'll find a lot of sympathetic readers in the ancient rabbis who also felt discomfort with these marital practices and therefore changed them. I mean, I am often moved to make the case that reform, even though it is a post-Enlightenment movement and phenomenon within Judaism, making of Judaism a sectarian expression of faith, the impulse to reform, lowercase r, reform as a verb, is baked into Rabbinic Judaism from the very first. So, I think Rabbinic Judaism is itself a systematic effort to reform Judaism, to reform biblical Israelite religion in ways that would allow Jewish communities to operate in step with the conventions of what was then modern morality, modern meaning first and second century morality. So Judaism is always reforming itself. So, our main study is of rabbinic literature, and just a handful of verses in the Bible provide ample fodder for the rabbis to write entire tractates of Talmud addressing these notions and reforming Judaism. So we're going to look at some of that. We're going to look at what the rabbis did with this biblical notion that if a husband is dissatisfied with his wife, he may write her a writ of divorcement or a bill of divorcement, as they say here, a writ of cutting off, and send her on her way from his household. In order to do that, it's helpful for us to take a peek at some of those core rabbinic texts that take up this subject. So, this is also a review text. We actually looked at this in our opening conversation on marriage several weeks ago, but I'm going to bring it back up on screen so that you can refresh your memory. So this is the signature passage that begins the Mishnah on Kiddushin, Kiddushin being the rabbinic term for the sacrament of marriage. I'm using the word sacrament intentionally to convey the force of Kiddushin from sacred or holy. And it teaches us that a woman can be acquired, that is to say, betrothed to a man to be his wife, in one of three ways. I'm elaborating just ever so slightly on the text as translated by Steinsaltz here. And she acquires herself, that is to say, she terminates the marriage, becomes independent again, in one of two ways. The Mishnah elaborates. She is acquired through money, document, and sexual intercourse. So, kesef, an item of value, conventionally a ring, a document known as ketubah, a writ of marriage, and sexual intercourse, which is symbolized, by the way, by the chuppah, which I sometimes, off the record, I wouldn't say this under a chuppah this afternoon when I'm officiating at a wedding, but I sometimes describe a chuppah as the birth canal for a new family. The images of Jewish weddings may be parsed as sexual. I have long believed that the concluding ritual of a Jewish wedding, breaking a glass, may be a throwback to pagan customs evoking the breaking of the hymen. And not for nothing, the first act that used to be commanded following the Jewish wedding ceremony was for the couple to go off on their own and consummate the relationship. There is even a custom, an ancient custom, that an escort would be stationed by the closed door of the chamber where the groom and bride have secluded themselves following the breaking of the glass in order to ensure that their privacy is not disrupted by others so that they can do what they need to do. Now, some of these customs have actually been preserved. Obviously, the breaking of the glass, and immediately following the chuppah ceremony, a couple does retreat to a seclusion known as yichud, which means seclusion, or literally it means being joined. Yichud is a great word. It's related to echad, meaning one. So there's a union of the couple or a communion of the couple. It also means together. So it's alone together. Um, these days, instead of consummating the relationship sexually, Jewish couples, brides and grooms typically eat. Just the stand-in for sex in Jewish life is generally to nosh instead. But you've worked up an appetite if you have been fulfilling the tradition of fasting on the day of your wedding, which I generally discourage, by the way, as a matter of course. I think brides and grooms have enough anxiety on the day of their wedding. The last thing they need to do is deprive themselves of food and water. But generally the first thing you want to do after you get married today is have a bite to eat in yichud, in seclusion alone. And this is one of the most widely observed Jewish customs of marriage. I'm sure that we'll be observing it today, that a room is reserved for the bride and groom immediately after the ceremony, and they'll go seclude themselves, and the photographer will take some sunset pictures, and then they'll join the celebration a little bit late and get a dramatic entrance. And then it goes on to all of the particulars around these three methods of marital acquisition, including levirate marriage, which we don't need to recount here. The second paragraph in Mishnah Kiddushin is the one that concerns us today. Um, nope, not the second. Hang on. Where is it? Oh dear. I may have failed to flag the yeah, because now we're on to sacrifices and offerings. Um, so I'll need to find it elsewhere. I apologize. I always try to like call up my Safaria tabs before class begins, and in this case, I just missed it. So now you're watching a whole bunch of texts scroll by. Um, so I'll stop sharing the screen and I'll move on to the next text. In the case of divorce, and I feel like it was in that paragraph, maybe I just absent-mindedly blew it by. Um, so give me just one more second here. I apologize. Uh, Here we go. Yeah, okay. It was, never mind. It was in the second half of the first paragraph. I just scrolled past it too quickly. A woman acquires herself through a bill of divorce or through the death of the husband. So this is the relevant passage. And that's really all we need to know. There are two ways in which a woman can dissolve a marriage or can have a marriage dissolved. One is through a bill of divorce, which of course is the Aramaic word get, and the death of the husband, of course, terminates a marriage. And if a husband dies, a woman does not need a get to remarry. But uh, if the husband is still alive and they go through a divorce, she does need a get. Um, so what I'd like to do is just uh, give us some background on how divorce works in Jewish tradition, and we'll look at some text to do that, but kind of just by way of overview. Um, the most significant difference between the Jewish religious laws pertaining to divorce and the way the law works in Western society is that in Judaism, the state or the court, um, does not have in other words, the secular state or the court does not actually have the power, the authority to establish a marital bond or to sever it. So even though the Talmud famously teaches Dina de Malchuta Dina, one of those kind of like overarching Jewish precepts that every rabbinical student is compelled to memorize by year two of your studies. Dina de Malchuta Dina literally means the law of the land is the law. So Jews have thrived in part, I would even go on to say, in large measure, because of our religious commitment to be law-abiding citizens in all the many lands of our dispersion, right? If before 1948 and after the year 70, so for a 2,000 year period, give or take, Jewish people were not their own sovereign masters in a society governed by Jewish law exclusively. We were, in one form or another, guests in a host country. And that really is the dominant condition of most of Jewish history is that we are diasporic. Therefore, I think mostly as a matter of pragmatism, the Talmud makes it a legal precept that the law of the land is the law. But divorce is one area in which the law of the land is not sufficient to enact a a status, or in this case, the status of divorce, in a Jewish tradition or in a Jewish household. For that, you actually need to go above and beyond whatever the secular state declares is the necessary requirement or requirements for divorce. Um, so in Judaism, the action of getting married and uh, I would say correlated, the action of getting divorced can be achieved only by the two people concerned and the appropriate Jewish rituals and authorities that can solemnize a marriage through the witnessing of a ketubah, the exchange of a ring, and the standing under a chuppah. Traditionally conducted, as I said last week or the previous, by a rabbi, but it does not technically legally need to be solemnized by a rabbi. Anyone who is conversant with the laws and the rituals and the language of marriage can conduct a Jewish wedding ceremony. And similarly with divorce, only a Jewish court, a bet din, can supervise the writing and delivery of a get for the purpose of seeing that the procedure is carried out correctly. Um, Obviously, a man cannot marry a woman without her consent in Judaism. It is she who is married to him and not him to her. And the reason for this is that once polygamy was officially banned, it really did fall out of favor throughout most of Jewish civilization by the early rabbinic period. But the final nail in the coffin of polygamy in Jewish practice was hit home, was driven in by a very famous posek, a very famous Jewish legal authority named Rabbeinu Gershom, who was from Mainz, which is in Ashkenaz. So he's one of the early, most, celebrated Ashkenazi rabbis. So Ashkenaz being kind of like the Rhineland, Alsace-Lorraine, Mainz, in the 11th century, um, who declared once and for all that a man could not have more than one wife. So a husband is bound to his wife and legally obligated in the Jewish tradition, according to the Ketubah, by providing care, support, food, shelter, and sexual satisfaction. Um, but the Ketubah also provides for a mechanism by which a man can take another wife if and only if a get is issued. So that was really the force of Rabbeinu Gershom's declaration in the 11th century, that the only way a man could take a second wife is by the proper Jewish dissolution of the first marriage. I wouldn't go so far as to say nullification. A get does not annul the first marriage. In other words, it does not create a legal fiction to say the first marriage never was, never took place, but rather it dissolves the first marriage with the force of Jewish law so as to undo the provisions of the ketubah. The ketubah itself, as we've noted in the last few weeks, makes this unpalatable. In other words, Jewish tradition wants to disincentivize husbands from divorcing their wives. And so the main mechanism by which a ketubah makes divorce unpalatable is by stipulating a monetary penalty for the dissolution of the marriage. It's not that it can't happen, and sometimes it must, but Jewish tradition has a strong inclination for couples not to get divorced. It makes it difficult for couples to get divorced. Um, and we did touch on that over the last week. So just completing my thoughts on this. The wife, on the other hand, from the time her marriage begins, has bound herself entirely to this one particular man. And if, while still married to this man, in other words, not divorced, there is no get, if she goes and has sexual relations with another man, that constitutes adultery. And as we've perhaps noted, but I haven't said with quite this force, adultery is not a two-way street in classical Jewish tradition. In classical rabbinic tradition, adultery is a transgression that can be imputed only to the woman who is married to another man. She is, according to the law, according to her ketubah, bound to this one man, and therefore only, but not vice versa, interestingly. So consequently, uh, and for much of this material, I'm deriving my notes from Rabbi Louis Jacobs, who was a wonderful synthesizer of Jewish theology. So, in traditional Jewish law, it is the husband who must divorce his wife, not the wife divorcing her husband, even if the woman presents grounds for divorce, which can be legitimated by a Beit Din. Um, I'm going to stop here because I recognize that that's a lot to take in, and there's already been a hand up from Judy Gross. So why don't we have Judy comment? Then we'll look at some more text.
There's an amazing movie called The Get, which I'm sure many of you have seen, which is about a woman who wants a divorce. And the movie shows the fact that she tries, she goes before the Beit Din, they don't grant it to her, and years go by, and she's constantly trying to get a get.
Right. So this is and this we're if we don't get to it today, we'll get to it next week. This is the tragic moral quandary of the aguna, which literally means chained. So these are women who, and we touched on this last time, you can become an aguna um, through one of several pathways. One, the most tragic, I believe, and the one that is the one of, I think, the saddest features of ultra-Orthodox Jewish life, that a halachic workaround has not been uh, created for this. I believe that's a shanda, because there should be a halachic workaround, but no ultra-Orthodox authorities have accepted a halachic workaround for when a Beit Din refuses to give a get, even in cases where the woman has warrant, even in cases where the woman is in an abusive marriage. The get must be provided by the husband to the wife. It is, as we've just said, through Louis Jacobs, the husband who divorces the wife and not the other way around. So the only way to enact that outcome is through the issuance of a get. Now, even under normal circumstances, of course, you do have recalcitrant and difficult husbands who refuse to give a get. The normal course of events, the normal recourse for such wives who are dealing with a husband who refuses to issue a get, is to appeal to a Beit Din and to talk to the rabbi of the community and say, I need a get. And upon investigation of the claim, should the Beit Din find the woman's case to be valid, that she does have grounds for divorce, they can compel the husband to give a get. And that's what usually happens. But in some ultra extreme right wing, I could go on with, I want to make it clear that this is not the normal course of events, but unfortunately, it is a thing that happens in the ultra Orthodox world. The Beit Din will simply, as it were, side with the abuser and continue to perpetuate the victimization of the woman by not compelling the giving of a get. That does happen in the Jewish world. God forbid it should happen to anyone we know and love, but it does happen, and it really is, in my view, a moral shanda, and of course a tragedy for these women who are unable to escape abusive marriages. Um, so just reading, and of course, because these societies are so cloistered, I don't have direct access to this, but this is well attested, and there are many more moderate halakhic authorities within Orthodoxy. Remember, Orthodoxy is really a very internally diverse stream of Judaism itself. There are lots of different ways of being Orthodox. From my buddy Jonathan Morgenstern, I can have a beer with him at a restaurant in White Plains, to people just 15 miles away in Muncie who would never interact with me whatsoever. So, like that, all of that, we call that orthodoxy. Please note that we're talking about a fractional expression within orthodoxy. There are plenty of modern Orthodox poskim, halachic authorities, who also agree that the case of the Aguna is a shanda. You don't need reform rabbis to say that. That you have voices within Orthodox Judaism that are saying this. And yet, as of today, 2025, this remains an unsolved dilemma in the Haredi world, because no Haredi accepts a halachic authority that says a get must be compelled in an abusive marriage. It's really it's awful. Um, if we just read on a little bit here, I will share with you the following text, which actually is not from Gemara, but sometimes Gemara is so thorny and digressive that it's hard to know exactly what it's teaching us. Whereas Maimonides came along many centuries after the Gemara was complete to provide us with the first definitive code of Jewish law known as Mishneh Torah. If you studied with me for Elul, leading up to the high holidays, we did a handful of sessions on Mishneh Torah, Maimonides' code of law, on tshuva, on repentance. Today, we're going to look at Mishneh Torah on divorce. Unlike Gemara, Mishneh Torah is linear and logical and relatively easy to read, even in Hebrew. Let's tackle a little bit of the Hebrew and see if we can pat ourselves on the back for understanding it. So this is Maimonides' Mishneh Torah on divorce. Ein haisha mitgareshet ela bichtav. All right, so a woman may not get divorced except through a writ, except through something written. So ein ha'isha, isha being a woman, mitgareshet is the reflexive conjugation of the modern word for divorce, garash, which means to divorce. So a woman is not divorced. Ein is a negative conjugation. So ein ha'isha mitgaresh, a woman may not be divorced, ela, except in the case of bichtav, with something that is written, from kotev, the Hebrew verb to write. Shiagia, which must be conveyed to her, uchetav zeh hu anikra get. And this particular document, this written thing, uchetav zeh hu anikra, that is called a get. And Maimonides really breaks this down rather simply for us. V'asara dvarin hen ikar girushim min haTorah. And then Maimonides goes on, and here I'll skip to the English. He says the Torah establishes 10 principles, asara devarim, as fundamental for a divorce to be effective. And so here's where Maimonides delineates what are the 10 principles as fundamental to a divorce as understood in Jewish law. 1, that a man must voluntarily initiate the divorce. 2, that he must effect the divorce by means of a written document and through no other means. 3, or C, that this document must communicate that he is divorcing his wife and releasing her from his domain. 4, that it should utterly sever the connection between the husband and wife. 5, that the get should be written for the sake of the woman being divorced. In other words, not a generic letter, but it has to be specifically addressed, naming the woman whom he is divorcing. 6, that once the get is written, there should be no action necessary except its transfer to the woman. So once the get is properly scribed, it then needs to be conveyed physically to the soon to be divorced woman. Um, what did I say? 7, that he should actually transfer the get to her. 8, that he should transfer the get to her in the presence of witnesses. This is a legal proceeding, and just as the ketubah must be authorized by two duly constituted witnesses, just like we'll do this afternoon. And by the way, this afternoon is the wedding I've mentioned coming up over the last several weeks that I'm co-officiating with an Orthodox rabbi. So my colleague, Rabbi Shua Mermelstein, has provided that his stipulations for conducting a wedding, and he specifically is leading the ketubah portion of today's ceremony. He is responsible for providing two, as it were, kosher witnesses, which in the Orthodox world means Sabbath observant, kosher observant Orthodox Jews. So he and another gentleman will serve as witnesses. Although it is customary in 99% of the weddings I conduct without an Orthodox co-officiant, so in the Reform movement, that is to say, where both the bride and groom identify as, let's say, Reform Jews, more or less, they provide friends who are witnesses. I do keep to the traditional stipulations with maybe a little bit of wiggle room that the witnesses, while needing not be Sabbath and kosher observant Jews, I do want them to be Jewish, by which I take the broadest definition, meaning anyone who self-identifies as a Jew. I'm not going to go investigate their halachic status. If a person says they're a Jew, I take that person at their word. I allow for both men and women, being fully committed to the egalitarian precepts of Reform Judaism. And I do stick to the traditional restriction against ketubah witnesses being blood relatives of the couple, of either the bride or the groom. And sometimes the couple pushes back and they say, well, I don't understand what this is all about. And I say, well, let me break it down for you. In Jewish marriage, the point of a Jewish marriage, and I've expressed this in our class, is to welcome a new Jewish family to the Jewish community. And so the witnesses should be Jewish because their specific function, they are designated as witnesses in order to act as the official representatives or emissaries of the Jewish community. So they're there to say, we, as the representatives of the Jewish community, now welcome this bride and groom as a duly constituted unit or a new family. And why must they not be relatives? The answer goes back to the original reasons that the rabbis constructed these regulations around marriage in the first place, which was chiefly to form economic alliances between households or families. And you don't want a witness who could be tainted by any corrupt bias or potential for financial benefit by the two people, the two parties, groom and bride, being joined in marriage, right? So a cousin or a sibling is not a valid witness in the Jewish tradition because that person stands to benefit materially from this union, being a direct relative of bride or groom. So those two conditions must be met, and I do my best to adhere to them, though I'm not that much of a stickler. And I also allow brides and grooms, if they have a dear aunt or best friend who's not Jewish and they want to sign the ketubah, my own practice is that so long as two duly constituted witnesses, two Jewish non-relative witnesses do sign the ketubah, additional signatures do not invalidate the ketubah. In my view, those are just honorary signatories. And if it makes the couple happy, I'm happy to make couples happy because I think happy couples are happy things. So that's sort of, just so you understand, that's a lot on witnessing the ketubah, but it is required for you to understand that to know why Maimonides makes clear that there must also be two, parenthesis, duly constituted Jewish witnesses for a get. right? So these are legal stipulations that are actually even more broadly comprehensive in Jewish law. So, for instance, the rabbis in the Talmud also insist that you cannot sentence a person to death for a capital offense without the testimony of two witnesses. And even more stringently, the Talmud stipulates they actually have to be direct eyewitnesses to the crime of which the person is being accused, and that the accused must have been verbally advised of the wrongness of the transgression. So in other words, the rabbis made it very difficult to execute criminals. It made it clear that capital punishment could be enacted only on very, very stringent conditions. Mara, please.
So nowadays, a lot of people getting married write their own ketubas or change the wording of the ketubas.
Indeed.
So is that okay following with the you have to have two Jewish witnesses that aren't related?
Depends on what you mean by okay. It's it okay with me and most Reform rabbis? Sure. But a ketubah that is not actually written in the traditional Aramaic legal language of transaction and penalty is not a legally binding ketubah. It is, I would say, an aesthetic play on ketubah. In other words, so I like honoring the custom of the witnesses being Jewish and non-relative, a non-family, so that the couple and the community parses what's happening as an authentically Jewish ceremony. But having said that, 95% of the weddings I conduct, the couple has either written their own ketubah or has drawn stock language from ketubah.com or any number of other online purveyors, which actually provide a menu or a directory of alternative texts that are not the Orthodox text, that do not speak in the language of transaction, acquisition, and penalty, which, that are not generally written in Aramaic, but rather in modern Hebrew, that talk in the language of love and fidelity and values. It's like, here's the home we're creating, here's our sacred pledge to each other, we will honor each other's individuality, and so on and so forth. None of which is a Jewishly legally binding ketubah. So you might say, well, if you're going to allow couples to have such, kind of alternative, free-form, creative expressions of their quote unquote ketubah, why not just bend the rules a little bit more and allow them to have anyone to sign this document since it's not a binding ketubah? And my answer is it's just less Jewish, to make those permissions. I want the couple to understand that being married Jewishly means that you are joining a community of your fellow Jews. And that I still believe, even in today's multicultural American Jewish life, that there's a value in starting your family out by joining a Jewish community. All right, that's one of the messages I try to get across to every couple is that if you really take seriously what this wedding is all about, it's not just about the two of you joining each other. It's about the two of you being joined to the congregation of Israel, of being welcomed Jewishly as a new family. And in order to symbolize that commitment, having Jewish witnesses who also are not your blood family members is the most, I think, traditionally Jewish way of demonstrating that commitment to being part of the Jewish community. So, as with most things in Reform Judaism, I want the couples to be autonomous, informed respondents to the Jewish tradition and to make authentic Jewish choices, authentic Reform Jewish choices based on knowledge of what the meaning of these strictures and rituals is all about. Okay. Uh, Peter, you're next.
Did I see that Maimonides was saying the man must voluntarily give the get? But in modern times, you sometimes get a bet in who try to pressurize the man. So that would go against that, wouldn't it?
Correct, and therefore you have to read the rest of Mishneh Torah on divorce to get to that, because Maimonides will, I think a couple chapters down the road, and I didn't study all of this tractate in Mishneh Torah. He will get to the what ifs. What happens if the husband is non-compliant with the woman's desire to be divorced, and let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the woman does have legitimate rabbinic grounds for divorce. Then Maimonides gets into the proper procedures for compelling the issuance of a get. So that's the mechanism. The mechanism is that it has to be done voluntarily, but if he won't do it voluntarily and the woman has valid grounds for divorce, a bet din can compel the issuance of the get. I've seen that happen once in my rabbinate here at WRT, where a husband refused to give a get, and the bride, the wife, who is in this very unhappy marriage, sought counsel from WRT, and Amy Rosberg and I directed her to an organization called Kayama, Kayama. They still operate, I think, in Brooklyn. Their intention as an organization is to facilitate the issuance of a get in a way that is humane, efficient, and not financially burdensome. Their rates have gone up, but I think they're charging 800 or 900 bucks to start to finish to carry out this procedure. And I'm going to get into some detail about what that procedure looks like momentarily. So it still does happen, and now there are a couple of organizations that are working quietly to make sure that what is already an emotionally draining and incredibly traumatic experience, getting divorced, is not made more so by the burdens of fulfilling the Jewish law. Thanks, Peter. Anne, and then Michelle, please.
You said something about non-relative.
Correct.
Is that to get the get? I forget what it is.
Well, yeah, let me just clarify because I said a lot. Witnesses in the Jewish tradition broadly, and this is for all legal matters in Judaism. It's for writing a ketubah or for witnessing a ketubah. It's for witnessing a get. It's for witnessing, providing witness or testimony of witness at a trial, a capital trial. In Jewish law, witnesses must be Jews who are not blood relatives. And the idea is that a blood relative cannot operate without bias, right? You can't accept testimony from a blood relative and assume that it is valid testimony. And
A blood relative could, but what exactly is a blood relative?
mother, father, husband, mother, father, grandparent, brother, sister, child.
Okay, thank you.
Cousin, at least first cousin. I don't know because I'm not an Orthodox rabbi and I don't operate in the Orthodox world. Everything I know about this is derived from my learning. But my understanding is that at least through the level of first cousin, those relationships are restricted as witnesses. Beyond that, I would need to ask an Orthodox rabbi, and I will be with one this afternoon, so maybe I'll ask Shua if he knows how far out you can go before you are considered a non-relative.
Thank you.
Michelle, please.
Yeah, so even if somebody doesn't, a couple does not have if a couple has an alternative ketubah, and so it is not
It's not a
contractual
ketubah.
in the same, it's not a deal in the same way, but it's more, as you described some of the alternatives. Yet, are they or are they not considered Judaically married?
They are not. So this is an additional challenge. Like, look, a lot of this gets overlooked by the Orthodox authorities, at least in the modern world, because the other stipulations were fulfilled. In other words, going back to the biblical standard and taking it as a kind of article of faith that Torah law still in some way, symbolic or actual, supersedes rabbinic law. If a couple is sleeping together, they are already presumed to be a married couple because they've fulfilled. Remember where we included today from Mishnah Kiddushin, a woman becomes married through one of three actions or transactions: a writ, the exchange of an item of value, and sexual intercourse. any one of those is actually sufficient to fulfill the presumption of marriage. Therefore, you don't have cases of Orthodox rabbis saying, well, John and Kelly aren't actually legitimately married because their ketubah is a reform ketubah. And by the way, our ketubah is a reform ketubah. It is ketubah-esque, but it is not an Orthodox ketubah. But there would not be a challenge to the legitimacy of our marriage. And the same is true for 95% of the people I know at WRT who've gotten married under Jewish auspices, at least in the last 25 years. Most of them don't have Orthodox ketubot. Many of you probably do have an Orthodox ketubah. This whole cottage industry of like Hallmark ketubas is relatively new. So once upon a time, all ketubot were just the standard legal formula. But there's still a presumption that that constitutes enough of an intention to be married, together with the fact that a ring was exchanged and the couple's been sleeping together and operates as a monogamous couple in the Jewish community. There's no real grounds on which to challenge that marriage, though technically the ketubah is not a valid ketubah. Judy and Len, please.
Maya and Sadu have a very unkosher ketubah. The words are written in Hebrew, and the words are also written in Hindu. So there are two lines.
Right.
Every line is a two line.
Right.
It's
And I mean,
beautiful.
again, were they to try to participate in strict Orthodox Jewish life, they'd run into some problems. I mean, on the one hand, their children are Jewish because Maya is Jewish, right? And Maya was born to two Jewish parents, so she's halakhically Jewish. There's no question about the Jewish status of their kids. However, interfaith marriage is simply not a thing that is recognized in Orthodoxy. It's not legitimate. And that's why Orthodox rabbis won't preside over interfaith weddings. Neither will conservative rabbis. Reform, Reconstructionist, non-affiliated rabbis, plenty of rabbis conduct interfaith weddings. And they do so legally, but as I said at the very outset of today's session, just because a wedding is duly solemnized under the secular legal auspices of the state does not actually provide the force for a wedding to be Jewishly recognized. It's one of those rare exceptions to Dina de Malchuta Dina that the law of the land is the law, the overriding law.
At the time they were married, Rabbi Jacobs wouldn't marry them. No one from WRT would marry them.
Right.
But Cantor Merkel did sing at the wedding. He did.
Right. I knowingly broke with 60 years of WRT precedent in 2013 when I sent a letter to the congregation announcing that I was prepared to solemnize interfaith weddings. I provided extensive reasoning why, and I actually had in mind that either next week or more likely June 5th, we would talk about interfaith weddings from a Talmudic and halakhic perspective. So we're building to that. I think it would be a really interesting conversation. And then at that time, I'll share with you the documents I shared with the congregation 12 years ago. Since then, I've conducted, on average, 2 to 3, sometimes a little more, sometimes less, interfaith weddings a year, which is about 1 in every 4 or so, I would say, of the weddings I'm conducting these days is an interfaith wedding, making it far below the national average in Reform congregations, by the way. Not one have I regretted. I mean, I never regret bringing two nice people together in marriage. It's one of the most beautiful privileges of being a rabbi. But I have only felt that I've done some good for the Jewish people when I've stood under a chuppah and have worked with couples to solemnize their intentions, not just to be married, but to establish a Jewish home within the Jewish community, which is the point of a Jewish wedding. If you take nothing else away from this entire unit of study, I hope you'll take that away. Len, would you comment, please?
Well, I have a dear friend who's a North Orthodox woman, psychologist who works in a community in Williamsburg. It troubles me. It's a pathos that there are women who are beaten, abused for and are not allowed out of this marriage. This is not make believe. She says that it is impossible at times to take a woman out of the Orthodox community and explain to them what is happening, even the rabbinate. And it's very disappointing to me to hear this going on in the Jewish religion.
Correct. We should all be outraged, um, deeply saddened and ashamed that this goes on in the Jewish community. As part of a larger cluster of anti-modern, um, unethical practices that are perpetuated within the extreme sects of any religious community. Um, it is, in my view, a mark of shame on Jews and Judaism generally. I would commend to all of you, though I can't say for sure whether it's still available for streaming, but on Netflix, if you hadn't seen the miniseries Unorthodox, starring the astonishingly gifted young actor Shiri Haas, who I believe is going to be appearing in Fauda season 5, though the release of Fauda season 5 was actually delayed because they had to rewrite the script after October 7th. That's a sidebar. Shiri Haas plays a woman in exactly this position. That's what this story's about. So if you want to see a really compelling, wrenching, dramatic take on exactly the nightmare that Len is conveying from a personal acquaintance who works in Williamsburg, I would commend the series called Unorthodox to you. But it won't be an easy watch, that's for sure. None of us should abide this easily. Again, though, for change to happen, it's going to happen from within this cloistered community. Massive, massive pressure. And again, this is one area because a lot of this persists in Israel, more so than in America, where American law at least is less tolerant of the abuses within ultra-Orthodox society. But this happens. It's fairly, I mean, not common, but it happens in Israel. It's well known. And with the kind of uh, benign assent of the Israeli government, which is in thrall to uh, many of these ultra-Orthodox rabbis who allow this shanda to persist. Peter, please.
Um, can I just go a bit further and ask because I don't know, if the American reform movement agreed to same-sex marriages?
Yeah, that's a great question. We can take that one up, I think, on June 5th as well, or maybe even start it next week, because I was hoping to do like a kind of catch-all session on marriages that reside outside of halakha and how the reform movement has used halakha thoughtfully to respond. So I'll just give like a teaser trailer instead of the deep dive, which I hope you can join us or at least catch up on YouTube in a couple of weeks. Maybe even starting next week, just depending on how much more we do today. Um, when I was a rabbinical student, this was the most frontal halachic or Jewish legal issue, Jewish ethical issue that the reform movement was addressing. So we're going back to the mid to late 90s. So we're going back just under 30 years ago when I was in rabbinical school. And perhaps surprisingly, it was actually divisive at the time. Um, the the body that weighs in on halachic matters in the reform movement is known as the Responsa Committee. Responsa is a medieval genre of Jewish literature that is composed exactly the way the name sounds. It is a series of letters that are written with questions and answers. So this practice, which originated in Europe in the Middle Ages, begins with a community presenting its community rabbi, its local rabbi, with a question or a dilemma that the rabbi cannot personally resolve authoritatively, or simply will say, actually, I don't know the answer to that. That's a really tricky question because, Jewish law is vast, but it still can't possibly address every real life case that might come up. So a community would ask its rabbi. The rabbi could then write the question known as a she'elah, which is the Hebrew word for a question, to a regional or well-known rabbinic authority, halakhic authority, who would take the question and compose what's known as a tshuva. By the way, same word that means repentance, but it also means to answer, a response. So it's a question and answer form of genre of Jewish legal literature. The rabbi would ask a question, the senior or the more authoritative rabbi would prepare a tshuva, and then it would be sent back to the community. By the way, this process could take months and months and months, which sometimes meant that the response, though possibly compelling or logical, could not actually be enacted because too much time had elapsed, depending on the circumstance that was being addressed. So the Reform movement actually resurrected this practice under the pen of two outstanding rabbis, one of whom was the protege to the other. So the name that is associated with responsa literature in the Reform community was the great Rabbi Solomon Freehoff, and then his disciple Walter Jacob, who was a rabbi in Pittsburgh for like a generation, took this up, and their practice in the Reform movement was to constitute a committee. This committee still exists, by the way. Reform rabbis can apply to be a member of the Responsa Committee. WRT's own Rabbi Levy was a member of the Responsa Committee. And the committee meets to field real questions from real rabbis working in congregations or not, working in the field in one way or another, that can't be resolved by the rabbi's own knowledge and authority. And the Responsa Committee of the Reform movement in the late 90s was, in fact, taking up the question, which was, may a Reform rabbi solemnize gay weddings? And it may surprise you to learn that the Responsa Committee, by a vote of 7-3 or 8-2, I have to go and look, voted against it and basically said no. And there are a number of times where I've been surprised by the responsa, but remember, they're using traditional halachic mechanisms to address modern concerns. But the story doesn't end there. The dissenting opinion, which was the chief author, was Rabbi Bernard Mellman, who's one of my dear friends and mentors, whose son, Jonathan Mellman, by the way, is a congregant at WRT. Bernard Mellman authored a sharply worded dissent that garnered as much attention as the majority opinion. And then, I think a matter of months or within a year later, the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, not the Responsa Committee, but the full assembly, passed a resolution permitting Reform rabbis to exercise their own authority and encouraging Reform rabbis to make the choice to solemnize homosexual weddings. So we're going to do this. We're going to look at some of these documents, I think, in a few weeks because it's fascinating. And then the URJ, the synagogue arm of the Reform movement, doubled down again in fairly short order. I think all of this was happening between 97 and 98. Though I'll go in 97 and 98, 99. The URJ basically went all in and said we should be welcoming gay couples, including rabbis solemnizing gay marriages. And that went on to become the accepted dominant position of the Reform movement. What do we learn from this? Well, among many things, that the Responsa Committee does not hold a whole lot of real-world authority. In other words, like most things in Reform, they may get a vote, but they certainly don't get a veto. And that at the end of the day, the overriding ethos of the Reform movement is that the individual, whether it's the Jew in the pew or the individual authority, the rabbi, the cantor, the educator, is entrusted with the authority to make an autonomous, informed Jewish choice. So, in other words, I can't be censured for conducting interfaith weddings or for refusing to conduct interfaith weddings or for conducting gay marriages or for refusing to conduct gay marriages. There's no mechanism by which the reform movement can say Blake is outside reform practice if he does or does not do any of these things. I am invested with the authority by my own movement to make a thoughtful Jewish choice and to be expected to be able to teach and substantiate that choice in authentic Reform Jewish language. Okay, that's different, by the way. This is a key difference between how Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism operates in the real world. In Conservative Judaism, there are mechanisms uh, for censuring or even I don't know about expelling. I don't want to go so far as to say that, but for dealing with rabbis who conduct interfaith weddings against the teaching of the conservative movement, where greater authority resides in the seminary. If JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, says this is in our movement is kosher and this is not, rabbis are expected to adhere to that, and there are mechanisms for their censure or even removal. But I'm not sure how that actually plays out in the real world. The person to ask would be my colleague, retired rabbi of Temple Israel in White Plains, Gordon Tucker, who's considered probably the chief living halachic authority for the conservative movement, and he lives 2 blocks from my house. So if you're curious about that, I'll ask him. He likes scotch, and I'll have him come to my office and say, I've got some good single malt if you can help me with this real life question. Okay. Anne, you have a comment, and then we're going to go back to the text, please.
You were talking about people being relatives, blood relatives. What about, I have this in my family. I had an aunt and uncle, they're not alive anymore, but they were blood relatives.
What about it?
Is that accepted? I guess it depends how close the relationship is.
They are not, your aunt and uncle could not sign Anne Cohen's ketubah.
Oh,
That's all.
but could they be married
Of course.
as,
To each, do you mean to each other?
yes.
Were they,
I'll tell you, my father,
are they related to each other by blood?
yes,
How?
my father's sister was married to her mother's brother. That's closer than first cousins.
Wait, my father's sister
Yeah.
was married to,
My father's sister was married to her mother's brother. That's an uncle.
yeah, that's not kosher.
Well, so what about their children? Are they not kosher also?
Correct. I mean, not that again, like if it was a legal marriage, okay, but I'm like basically what you're saying is they were sisters, siblings-in-law, they were machatanim. Here,
Well,
let's take this one up offline. I'm a little bit confused by the circumstance, but I'm intrigued by this story. Let's move on. I'd like to pull up the rest of Maimonides' 10 conditions. So we spent a lot of time on witnesses, and then we went down 25 rabbit holes. Um, okay, then he should actually transfer it to her for the sake of divorce. This is once the document has been duly written and witnessed, and that the husband or his agent, because this can be conveyed by a duly appointed shaliach or agent, should be the one who gives it to her. The other requirements of a get, that is to say, dating it, meaning putting the proper date on it, having it signed by the witnesses and the like, are all rabbinic institutions. So what Maimonides wants to teach here is that all 10 of these precepts can be derived from the Torah law, which is Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 and following. Everything else about the specific way in which this goes down are the stipulations that the rabbis added to the practice of divorce. And so many of you, it brings me pleasure to say, have never been divorced, but some of you have. And I received some testimony from a personal acquaintance talking about going through a get, and I'd like to share it with you um, so that you can see how this plays out in the real world. And I think what I hope you'll take away is how strikingly similar this is to what we've just read, which of course makes sense that this really happens in the Jewish world. So this is an account I'm reading here. Uh, a get was provided for this person, a woman, who was seeking a divorce through the local Orthodox Rabbinical Council of the community in which they were living. Um, a formal Beit Din was convened with three rabbis presiding, all men, of course, Orthodox men. In addition, there was a scribe present. And by the way, when I've heard this written out before, there's a animal skin parchment, the same way, like the same conditions for writing a Torah scroll are im imposed on the writing of a get. So same conditions for the manufacture of the parchment from animal skin, the ink, the quill, all of that. So a sofer, a duly a competent scribe in the Jewish tradition, is present for the ritual. And the writer shared with me, I no longer remember what they asked me. Presumably, some sort of formulaic question confirmed that we indeed intended the marriage to end. In total, there must have been no more than one or two questions because otherwise I'd probably remember, she writes. What I do remember the most was the paperwork process. One of the members of the Beit Din slowly dictated text, which the scribe then slowly and carefully transcribed. This was in Hebrew and well beyond my comprehension. I would put an editorial here, probably Aramaic. When the document was complete, Aramaic uses Hebrew characters, so to the naked eye, it looks the same. When the document was complete, the scribe carefully read the text aloud, proofreading so that the Beit Din, meaning the three rabbis, could confirm its accuracy. It was indeed accurate. Then they proofread it again, repeating the process. Then the document was signed. As I recall, the writer adds, which is correct, the bride and groom do not sign their ketubah either, only the witnesses, unless it's a modern version. So the get as a contract signed just by witnesses would be parallel. Exactly right. Then this lovely, carefully scribed document was folded neatly, rather like origami, into a neat package, maybe 3 or 4 inches square. After the get was complete, proofread, and the origami folded, he, meaning my ex, had to place the paper packet into my hands, hands that I held out together like a cup or a bowl. I did not take the get, rather received it. To my shock, someone, whether the scribe or a member of the Beit Din, took a razor blade and then slashed one side of the paper packet at least 3 times. This, I was told, was so that no one else could use the document to demonstrate divorce. The rabbinical council would retain the official now slashed get. I was given a piece of paper reporting and certifying that the Beit Din had performed the appropriate process. And then just going on a bit, because I think this is a really moving personal account. Initially, I kept the certificate along with my civil divorce papers in a safe deposit box. Eventually, when I moved, I put the papers somewhere. If they ever show up, I am bound and determined to sift through all box goods in my house before I move again. And my husband is determined never to move again, so we'll be here a long while. Then I'll try to remember to provide a copy to accompany this account. And by the way, I would love to see that. A few observations. The get process is legal, it is not touchy-feely. But as this parallels the ketubah side of weddings, this rather makes sense to me. The Beit Din obviously recognized my marriage, although performed by a Reform rabbi, so that's really interesting. On the other hand, I did not think that they or other Orthodox authorities would necessarily recognize any divorce except an Orthodox one. So much for parallelism, and I think that's a correct observation, by the way. As I mentioned earlier, I very much wanted children, and I knew enough to recognize the limits of not having a hechshered get, in other words, a kosher get, a get that was authoritative in the Orthodox tradition, that the limits of not having such a get could place some serious limitations on my future offspring. I'm editorializing here, they'd be considered mamzerim or illegitimate should they decide to marry within the Orthodox community. Clearly, This turns out not to have been a constraint based on the way in which this person's family has now grown, but who knew? For the record, that first marriage lasted 5 years and was devastating when it fell apart. Now it's barely a blip as my husband and I just celebrated 30 years. Time does change things. So I'm moved that that account was shared with me and permission was granted to share it with you anonymously. This really does happen. I would say, a couple times a year, Amy Rosberg at the temple, our pastoral care director, and I are asked to help a woman facilitate the issuance of a get, and we do our level best to make it as easy as possible. But as our writer shared with us, nothing about this is easy or emotionally, straightforward. It's trauma, and I'm not sure that the ritual of the Orthodox issuance of a get in and of itself is intended to provide a kind of spiritual or emotional catharsis. It really is a legal mechanism. Therefore, very few, but some couples do elect to accept my invitation, which as a Reform rabbi, I offer anyone going through a divorce. I say, if you would like to do a Reform ritual of divorce, I'd be happy to create one with you. And there is some language that exists in the rabbi's manual or that we can create just, again, creatively to help express the meaning of this from a spiritual emotional standpoint and not just effectuate a legal outcome. Okay, Mom and Dad, you've had your hand up for a while, so why don't you chime in, please?
Could you bring up Maimonides' list of requirements again?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. The good news is I did not close that tab. Just want to get the text looking good. Okay, here we go.
I am looking at D.
Okay. Yes.
Because there is no stipulation in any of this or anything that we've discussed as to the status of children that occurred during the marriage.
Right. So even though if children uh if children result from the marriage, right? If the couple while married have children, there's no issue with their Jewish or legal status. There's no real category of custody in the Jewish tradition. So there's no implied custody belongs to the husband or the wife, though I am not deeply enough conversant in Jewish divorce law. I could read more on Maimonides to even know if that is taken up in the law. The question of, well, whose kids are the kids, particularly if they are younger than the age of majority. The chief question with which the halacha is concerned is, are the kids legitimate? And so long as they were produced in a legitimately or a duly constituted Jewish marriage, the kids are legitimate children. I think the question you may be asking or implying is, well, what happens to the kids? And
I mean, Hagar took
Hagar took Ishmael.
took Ishmael with her.
Mm-hmm.
Which you could think of other circumstances in which other patriarchs might want to say, I don't want this daughter to leave me. I want her, to stay with me.
Great.
But there's nothing spoken of here at all.
Yeah, and look, I mean, we are mom, dad, and I are all family of my younger sister who did go through a divorce and a rather agonizing custody battle. And, now, many years later, by the way, my sister happily remarried. I don't even know. I never asked Becky if she received a get. I assume she would have.
She did. She did.
Yeah.
She had to go to Brooklyn, and she,
Yep.
I guess, from what I remember, described a legalistic process that was not unkind or
Right.
or coercive in any way, but it
Yeah,
was
probably almost identical to the, probably very much like the account I just shared with you
Exactly.
from a member of our community. So
That's what it sounded like.
yeah, I think so. My sister went through this process. It will be interesting. I'm going to see her for birthday festivities for her over the weekend. So maybe I'll ask her. That'll be fun birthday party conversation. How was your Tell me about
Good.
your Jewish divorce. But I don't think
Right before the candles are blown out, John. Good choice.
Thank you. We all went through that as a family, of course, as more than just passive bystanders. It was all wrenching for all of us. But what I don't recall is any Jewish mechanism to deal with the custody issues. My understanding is that all of that resided with the secular court, and that there was no Jewish mechanism for advising, much less compelling a custody arrangement. And Becky's three children were all minors at the time. They still are. So anyway, it's not ancient history, but in line with my congregant who says what was devastating at the time now barely registers as a blip. Happily married and remarried. The same is true for my sister, who just celebrated this past November 6 years of marriage to her husband, and still has a more or less amicable relationship with her ex, and they continue successfully to co-parent their three children. So,
And even though I hope in many, many years in the future her current husband may pass away, she cannot remarry her first husband. Thank God.
okay, well, yeah, I will allow your editorial to stand simply because it is accurate from a biblical standpoint.
That's all I intended.
There you go. Linda and then Karen, please.
So I just want to say I got a get also. I believe it was in Brooklyn, but what I remember most is that they did give me the scroll, but that they would not touch me. That is what I remember most about
Right.
that ceremony. I thought that was very interesting.
Right, and one thing that is also consistent with Orthodox practice, because by the way, up until they're not allowed to touch you no matter what, but especially as a married woman, because up until the moment that you accept the document, you're still a married woman. So that would be a real no-no in Orthodox tradition. Um, and I was going to say something else related to this. It slipped out of my mind, but thank you for sharing, Karen.
This is a question about parenting.
Yeah.
It's a follow-up to your father's question. And I just wonder if you could just reflect in your broad knowledge,
No.
what is the ownership status of children? In other words, is it anything like what you've described about men owning the woman?
Not at all.
Okay,
Not at all.
and never will be, and never, well, we don't know that, but never was, never modified.
Um, for that, I would have to prepare a semester's worth of
Okay,
great text and teaching on
okay,
parenting in the Jewish tradition, which is a whole fascinating discourse.
hey,
About
go for
which
it.
yeah, I mean, but to my knowledge, interestingly enough, the children remember what I've said from the outset, that the point of a Jewish wedding or a Jewish marriage is to establish a duly constituted new family within the Jewish tradition. It really is the only mechanism by which a new family can be recognized and welcomed into the Jewish community. Children, on the other hand, are whether by birth or adoption or surrogacy, or in the modern world, the many different ways in which children can, come into a family. There is no requirement for a legal mechanism to to uh, to count them as members of the family. Instead, there is a covenant ceremony for boys, where the expectation is that a boy will be circumcised with a brit milah on the eighth day, which we studied this past fall, you may recall, and that is given a name that identifies him as Jewish and the child of his parents. Similarly, a name is given to a Jewish girl, which stands in for her induction into the covenant of the Jewish people. But that happens, as it were, almost organically. It just sort of happens, and so long as you do that ritual thing of circumcision and naming, a child is considered a member of the community of Israel. And there's no document, there's no witnesses. It's the parent is obliged to welcome the child into the covenant. And the only obligation that is imposed on the child vis-a-vis the parent is the oft repeated maxim in the Torah, variously formulated as honor thy father and mother, or as it appears in Leviticus, not Exodus, honor thy mother and father. So the idea of kavod or kabed, like there's still an ethical obligation that is imposed on children vis-a-vis their parents. And while there are many obligations imposed on parents upon their children, those are not ever provided in a legal context as legally ordained stipulations for parenting. So that's sort of like my thumbnail sketch by way of answering your question, but it's a fascinating subject of much, much deeper inquiry that we won't do today. But you're giving me all sorts of curricula ideas for the future.
Thanks. And by extension, you would also say that there is no designation of ownership of by
No.
either mother versus father.
A child is not owned by the parents.
Right.
A child is understood to be an independent entity whose parents have a sacred responsibility to which I can provide or assign much Jewish language to nurture and nourish in suitably Jewish ways. But none of that falls into the kind of property law or a property law adjacent way in which marriage is formulated in the Talmud.
Thank you.
And we saw this last week. Ketubah is really very much derived from property law. There are many, many similarities between the acquisition of a wife and the acquisition of property. Obviously, the comparison is not infinitely elastic. Okay, we have a few more minutes, and with them, I'd like to take a look at just a little bit more on how this goes down. So if you would like to visit the following website, you can actually see one rabbi who seems to have set up a cottage industry in helping people get a get. Rabbi Pasternak at getjewishdivorce.com. And this is Rabbi Pasternak's website. Who's Rabbi Pasternak? This guy. So he seems like a nice guy. He's a conservative ordained rabbi. And he provides here his qualifications and where he's also a certified divorce and family mediator. And it seems like this is like his main gig. So you can actually learn a lot about the get process. I found this a very easy to navigate website. He asks for applicants to apply for a get, and then he will act as your agent. So you must appoint him as your agent to have a get written and delivered. And then the get is actually written. It is ritually delivered. That's the origami and slashing process that we heard so beautifully described in such wonderful detail. And then the get is archived in the Rabbinical Assembly of America and deposited in a secure archive. And there they'll receive what's called a patur, which means nullification or dissolution, a certificate of Jewish divorce that stands as the proof that the process was carried out according to Jewish law. So you can learn all about that. And by the way, there's a wealth of other knowledge, not just practical, but there's like all of these. So if you go here and you see it has actual photocopied excerpts from this incredibly important book that I advised you to pick up last week, called A Guide to Jewish Religious Practice by conservative Rabbi Isaac Klein. He actually includes here a couple of excerpts from that book, like long form excerpts. So if you really want to read every jot and tittle about the laws of divorce and marriage, you can study with me, or you can read a couple of chapters in this book here, or you can go to Rabbi Pasternak's website, getjewishdivorce.com, and read all about it. It sounds like, remember like those crazy commercials for Crazy Eddie? Or was that just like a Philadelphia thing? Getjewishdivorce.com. If you want a Jewish divorce, you can learn everything about it.
If you don't get a get from me, you was robbed.
Right. Okay. So
Yeah.
yeah, so you can read all about it, and even see here like the subheadings of the chapter on divorce includes things about which we now know from our learning together The sofer, meaning the scribe, the witnesses, the material, writing the get, what the get actually says, the date, place, and time. And I even found on his website some pretty cool stuff. So I set up a couple of separate tabs just for show and tell today, where you can actually see a the actual text. So again, this is just a small excerpt. So this is where the Rabbinical Assembly of America provides its language for a certificate of divorcement or a ti'udat girushin. I'm going to enlarge it, bring it up here. So this is all on page 489 and following in Isaac Klein. And this is the actual text of the get. There's guidelines for the correct way to spell it. But here's what it says in English. On the such and so day of the such and so month, year, at the Bet Din of the Rabbinical Assembly of America, came duly to be heard the petition of so and so of location, praying that the marriage heretofore existing between him, so the petition is officially the husband's, even if the wife is the one requesting the divorce, and his wife, her name goes in this blank here, of location, be terminated and declared null and void, whereas the said parties had obtained a civil decree of divorce in the state of, name of state here, and whereas the petition of the husband for divorce was heard, and the scribe had duly written the bill of divorce according to Jewish statutes, and the writ had been duly delivered by the husband, name of husband here, to the wife, the court declared the said marriage dissolved, and the wife hereby divorced from her husband. It shall be lawful for the said husband rather, to marry any other Jewess. So this is a document that actually, while not strictly required under Jewish law, is provided for husbands seeking to be remarried to a Jewish woman. So there's all sorts of like fun things that you can read about in Isaac Klein, and I thought it would be fun to share them. So next week when we pick up, maybe we'll dive right into those extramarital affairs, by which I mean we'll take up the subject of gay marriage and interfaith marriage, both in Jewish law but also in Reform Jewish practice, and how the Reform movement understands and negotiates the way in which marriage plays out in the modern Jewish world. I would find it very gratifying to share some of that with you next week. So until then, I'll look forward to seeing you.
Kol hakavod, John.
Happy Memorial Day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Peter. Always grateful to join you from across the pond. Take care.